Heaven Official's Blessing, guan by xiang tong, read by Plant Bones. Chapter 8, Shortened Distance, Adrift in Sandstorms, Part 3. In the speed of a second, before the snake had his chance to sink its fangs into Sunlung, Celian's hand shot out and snatched it right at the heart with blinding precision. Given his strength, Celian could crush the snake's heart if he wanted to, rupture its innards and spill its insides. But not knowing whether the snake's flesh was also poisonous, he didn't dare press harder. Celian raised his other hand to grab for the tail, but the snake was slippery and artful, making it difficult to catch. Celian squeezed, but he only felt something soft and cold slither away from his fingers. The next moment, a sharp needle pain flared from the back of his hand. The scorpion tail! After the sting, Celian snatched the tail and captured the snake properly, then squeezed down hard until it fell unconscious. Even having been stung, Celian's face never changed, and he tossed the unconscious snake onto the ground indifferently. "Everyone be careful, there may be more snakes around." He felt a tight grip on his wrist before he finished, and looked to see that it was Sunlung who had caught hold of him. "Sunlung?" Celian was slightly taken aback. The reason he sounded confused was because, at that moment, the expression on the youth's face was off. It was unexplainable, frosty, almost to the point of being frightening. His eyes were focused intently on the tiny wound on the back of Celian's hand. The wound themselves were originally the size of needle punctures, but the venom was vicious. The back of his hand had immediately swelled up angrily with a large patch of purply red, and those small puncture wounds had visibly enlarged to the size of knife cuts. With a dark expression, Sunlung wordlessly snatched Rue from Celian's arm and immediately knotted it firmly on his wrist, preventing the venom from advancing. While Rue enjoyed snuggling up to Celian, it wasn't normally that well behaved, and yet in Sunlung's hands it was so compliant it was like it was dead. For all the time they'd known each other, Celian had never seen Sunlung look like this. He opened his mouth to speak, but Sunlung turned to pull a dagger off the waist of one of the merchants. Nanfeng saw and knew instantly what Sunlung was about to do, and he ignited a palm torch. Without sparing a look, Sunlung burned the tip of the dagger to disinfect before turning back to Celian and drawing a cross over the puncture wound. Just as he was about to lower his head to the hand, Celian hurriedly said, "It's okay. The venom is aggressive. Sucking it won't do much. I don't want you to get poisoned." Sunlung ignored Celian's protest, tightening his hold on Celian's hand, and placed his lips upon it. Celian felt his own arm tremble slightly, and he couldn't explain why. Next to him, Fu Yao said in disdain, "I can't believe you went and got yourself stung. What were you doing catching the snake when the kid might not have even been bitten? You're just causing unnecessary trouble." That was true, now that Celian thought back to the airy way Sunlung played with the snake in the cave. He probably wouldn't have even cared about an attack and would have easily avoided being bitten. But just in case Sunlung didn't notice the snake in time, then wouldn't it be too late for regrets? Celian waved his good hand. "Don't worry, it's not like it hurts, and I won't die from it." "You're really not in pain?" "Really, I don't feel pain anymore," Celian answered honestly. His words were true. Celian was someone who possessed the worst of luck, so when he ventured deep into the mountains, 8 times out of 10 he would step on vipers or run into venomous insects and getting bitten, stung, jabbed, poisoned in thousands of ways. However, he'd always been very stubborn about not dying. And at most, he'd run a fever. After 3 days and 3 nights of fever, he'd wake up right as rain and continue on as if nothing had happened. He simply wasn't sensitive to pain, so as much as it hurt, he could live with it. Right after he said this, Sunlung finally looked up. The red swelling on the back of Celian's hands had gone down, and Sunlung's lips were stained with blood. His eyes were extremely cold, and he moved his glare to the unconscious snake on the ground. There was a loud boom, and the snake abruptly exploded into a purplish-red pool of blood and flesh. The sudden blast surprised everyone, but no one knew who did it. Even if the blood didn't splatter onto anyone, there was still a feeling of unease blanketing the crowd. Xiang remembered that Xialian had also been stung and asked worriedly, "Gugu, you got stung too. What'll you do?" Xialian felt the bandage on his wrist and smiled. "Don't worry, little one. We'll stick to the plan of going to the Baiyue ruins and searching for the Xiaoyue fern." Another merchant asked, "You guys are going? What about us? Should we send someone to go with you?" "You can all stay here. Baiyue territory is dangerous. The more people there, the more mishaps can happen. We'll find the fern and bring it back to you within 24 hours, Xialian said. Will you really? Thank you so much. How can we possibly ever? The number of the merchants started stuttering in their thanks, but their faces changed when Xialian continued to speak. "In order to reach Baiyue as soon as possible, I want to borrow your guide temporarily, if that's all right." Naturally, Xialian meant Azhao. The merchants went from grateful and relieved to largely hesitant. Xialian knew where they were coming from. They were afraid that Xialian might run off with their guide once he found the Xiangyue fern. Or even if Azhao didn't run away, he would still be greatly delayed. Nevertheless, none of them wanted to venture into that wicked place where at least half go missing. So it was a huge dilemma. Their worries were perfectly normal, so Xialian quickly added, "And just in case anything else comes to attack you, Fu Ya will stay here until we return." With one man staying, the merchants finally agreed and nodded. "All right, as long as Azhao is willing to go with you." Xialian turned to Azhao. "Are you open to lending us a hand, my friend? If not, that's okay too." Azhao nodded and said, "Yes, but the Banyue ruins are actually not hard to get to. Just keep going in this direction and you'll reach them." After bidding the merchants farewell, Azhao took to lead with Xialian, Sanlang, and Nanfeng following right behind. A while later, Xialian inquired, "Azhao, do the scorpion snakes appear frequently in this area?" "Not frequently. This was my first time seeing them too," Azhao replied. Xialian nodded and had no more questions. Truthfully, he did live in the Baiyue area for a number of years. This was also his first time seeing a scorpion snake. Azhao's answer was not surprising. Nanfeng realized Xialian's intentions and asked in a low voice, "You're suspicious of Azhao?" Xialian responded in a whisper, "Either way, we've brought him out. Just keep an eye on him." In the past, it was usually Sunlang who would talk to him first. Xialian wasn't sure if it was because of the incident earlier, but the youth still looked rather upset, walking without speaking a word. Xialian couldn't figure out what was going on and didn't know how to talk to him, so he kept on walking as well. The four continued to trek through the vast Gobi Desert for close to an hour. The windstorm had long since passed, and without any obstructions, they advanced quickly. Soon they could see ragged weeds here and there, growing in the cracks in the rocks and sand. But by the time the sun was setting, Xialian finally spotted an ancient walled city on the horizon. The city was difficult to see because it was the color of sand, camouflaged by the yellow so it became one with the desert. Some parts of the city walls were caved in and buried in the sand. As they approached, they found that the walls were extremely high, towering over 30 meters. It wasn't hard to imagine the city's past magnificence, how grand it must have been. Passing through the Barbishan, the four formally entered the kingdom of Baiyue. Past the gates was a wide and empty street, with dilapidated houses on each side and rotten beams and broken bricks strewn about. Perhaps out of habit, Azhao cautioned the others. "Please be careful and don't leave the group on your own." The other three didn't need that reminder. The actual Baiyue city was far different from what they'd imagined. Nanfeng wondered, "This is the kingdom of Baiyue? It's smaller than the capital." "A desert country is only as big as the oasis it's built on," Xialian explained. At its peak, the population was only about 10,000. It was actually pretty lively in a small city like this. Nanfeng continued to observe the surroundings. It would probably only take a few days to siege the country of this size. Xialian shook his head. Not necessarily. Don't underestimate the people of Baiyue, Nanfeng. Even if their population wasn't more than 10,000, they kept the number of soldiers at an average of 4,000. There were more men than women. Aside from the sick and old and farmers, most men joined the army. Besides, the majority of the soldiers were over 3 meters tall, each more violent than the next. With maces in hand, they would keep fighting, even with swords through their chests. They were very hard to fight. Aziao seemed rather surprised and glanced at Xialian. This young master seems to know a lot. Xialian maintained his smile and was about to converse some more when Nanfeng posed a question. What's that wall? He was indicating a giant yellow earthen building in the far distance. Building wasn't quite the right word to describe it. It was a giant enclosure formed by 4 massive mud-colored walls, with neither doors nor a roof. Each wall was over 30 meters, and on the very top there was a pole with something tattered and attached, flying in the wind. It was a chilling image. Xialian turned his head and glanced and then said simply, That's the sinner's pit. By the sound of the name alone, it was obvious that wasn't anything good. Sinner's pit? Nanfeng frowned. Humming gravely, Xialian explained. You can think of it as a jail. It was made specifically for imprisoning criminals. How does it imprison anyone if there isn't even a door? Throw them in from the top? Nanfeng wondered. Xialian hesitated to answer, then Sunlong suddenly spoke up. They do get thrown in, and the pit is full of venomous snakes and starving beasts. Xialian was relieved to finally hear him speak, though when he looked over to Sunlong, the boy met his gaze and turned away. Nanfeng swore. That's no fucking jail. That's torture. How cruel. The people of Baiyue were either sick in the head or savage psychos. Xialian rubbed his forehead. Not all of them were like that. Some were quite endearing. He paused suddenly, his brows furrowing. Wait. The other 3 stopped, and Xialian pointed upward. Look at that pole above the pit. Is there a person hanging from it? In the dimming light of the setting sun at such a distance, it was difficult to see what exactly was hanging from the pole. But going closer and scrutinizing the shape, it became obvious that there was a scrawny little person in black, their clothes unkempt, dangling in the wind like a rag doll. It is a person, Sunlong confirmed. When Aziao saw the hanging person, his face paled. This was such a bizarre, anguishing display that even a calm individual like him couldn't bear the sight of it. Just then, Sunlong tilted his head and said in a low voice, Someone's here. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Xialian also heard feather-light footsteps approaching. The 4 immediately moved to hide in the many decaying houses on the roadside. Xialian and Sanlang entered the one house, and Nanfeng and Aziao hid in another one across the street. Soon after the end of the broken street, the female cultivator in white appeared. The woman was dressed in a pale white robe with a whisk tucked in her arm, the garb of a Taoist priestess. She roamed along the street, peering here and there. Her eyes were bright and observant, as if she were in her own backyard garden, not the Banyue ruins. Strolling right behind her was another woman clad in black, her hands clasped behind her back. The black-clad woman was beautiful yet cold. Her eyes were piercing, her raven hair long and free. It was like she radiated chill from her very person. Although she was walking behind the female cultivator, no one mistake her for a subordinate. These were the same 2 they'd seen outside the abandoned inn at noon. At that time, they had passed by too fast, and Xialian couldn't make out the detail of the lady in black, but now he saw clearly that she was indeed a woman. If the one in white was the state preceptor of Baiyue, who was the one in black? The state preceptor swished her whisk leisurely and spoke. Now where did they go? We were careless for one moment, they all disappeared. Do I have to dig them out and kill them one by one? Just as Celian thought, they were being watched from the moment they stepped foot into the city. The lady in black approached and stoically said, "You can call your friends to help you kill them." By friends, she must have been the soldiers of Ban Yue. The state preceptor Ban Yue laughed. I don't like calling other people. I like calling you. Aren't you glad? The lady in black ignored her completely and said coldly, There's nothing agreeable about being about the There's nothing agreeable about being called out by the likes of you for something like this. Just go." The state preceptor of Bayue arched her brows, but still sped away. Listening to them, it sounded as if they were close. They were no ordinary folks, so the lady in black must be someone of renown. Someone who would be close to the state preceptor of Bayue? A mysterious fellow cultivator? Or was there a queen or general they didn't know about? Celian was trying to connect the dots rapidly in his mind, but he held his breath. Now wasn't the time to be discovered. It looked like the state preceptor had an unpredictable personality. If she should find them and excitedly summon in her legendary 9-foot-tall, mace-wielding Bayue soldiers, more time would be wasted fighting them. 24 hours. 1 hour wasted was another hour they'd sink deeper into danger. But there was no helping his bad luck. Whatever he didn't want to happen would always happen. The lady in black was passing the house Celian hidden, but stopped mid-step, and her piercing gaze swept over the decayed shelter. The state preceptor of Bayue was already further ahead, but she noticed that her companion had stopped and come back around. "Hey, are you coming?" The lady in black didn't look at her. "You, step back." "All right." The state preceptor responded, obediently, and actually retreated. The lady in black was about to raise her hand when suddenly a loud rumble blasted from across the street. On the other side, the house Nanfeng and Axiao had hidden in had collapsed. The crumbling of one house led to the entire row to cave in. Dust and sand rolled into the air and clouded the whole street. Within that cloud, a black shadow leapt out and shot a streaming flame toward the state preceptor, but the lady in black rushed forward and shielded her from harm. With her left hand still behind her, she flipped her right palm and easily absorbed the flames before reflecting them back. The black shadow parried her while escaping and soon disappeared. The state preceptor immediately chased after that shadow, but the lady in black gave the house behind her another sweeping look before following. "Bless you, Nanfeng," Celian thanked mentally. Everything happened so quickly, but Nanfeng had no doubt known that somehow they were about to be in trouble and create a diversion to lead their enemies astray. He was the only one who leapt out, so Axiao must still be inside the collapsed house. After making sure the state preceptor and the lady in black were indeed gone, Celian dragged Sanlang out of their hiding spot and called out. "Axiao, are you still alive? Are you hurt anywhere?" A moment later, a muffled voice came from under the ruins. "I'm fine." Celian was relieved. Oh, thank goodness. Although Celian trusted Nanfeng's ability to control the crash, and that he would no doubt leave enough space for Axiao to stay safe, it was still more reassuring to see it with his own eyes. He raised one of the rotten beams with one hand, and after a moment, Axiao emerged from underneath, covered in dust from head to toe. He brushed himself off a bit and returned to his stoic expression. "Now there are only 3 of us left," Celian said. "Nanfeng is creating a diversion, so we must move faster. Do you know where we can find the Xiangyue fern, Axiao?" The young man shook his head and said, "Sorry, I only know where the city is. I've never been here before, so I don't know where the fern can be found." Sunlung spoke up. "They say the Xiangyue fern prefers shade. It's small, its roots thin, but its leaves are big, like a heart-shaped peach. Why not search near a large building?" "A large building?" Celian contemplated. If they were talking big, there was no building larger than the palace. In the legend, it was after the festivities that the queen picked a Xiangyue leaf, which could mean the fern grew on the palace grounds. The 3 moved their gaze far, and in the center of the city there was indeed a palace built out of brick and wood. From the distance, the palace had a grandiose aura, but upon a closer look, it was not in much better shape than the dilapidated houses on the streets. Although the palace gates were a massive garden, perhaps in the past it wasn't a garden but a palace square. With years of neglect, weeds had flourished and spread. Indeed, it wasn't sand beneath their feet now, but mud. There was most likely the last sign of the oasis that once was, and the Xiang fern could very well be growing amongst all the other plants. "Let's not waste time," Xie said. "We only have 24 hours, but keep an eye out for scorpion snakes." Axiao and Sanlang both hummed in acknowledgement and lowered their heads to start searching through the plants. As they rummaged, it suddenly occurred to Xie that if the state preceptor Ban Yue could control scorpion snakes, there should be an abundance of them slithering about in her territory. Ever since they entered the city, they hadn't seen a single snake. He straightened up and was about to speak when his hands fell on a long object. Looking down again, he found what was a human leg. Xie withdrew his hand and was struck speechless. It occurred to him that every time he was faced with some horrifying incident, or saw or touched anything frightening in the dark, it was always the other party who would scream before he could say anything. Shouldn't it be the other way around? The plants in the garden were all thick and tall, and whoever's leg Xie had touched was someone who had already been hiding and crawling in the weeds. The moment they touched, the leg recoiled, and the weeds in front of him rustled. Someone called out, "Don't hit me! Don't hit me! Gaga, it's me!" Xie scrutinized the wild grass and saw that the one who emerged crying, "Don't hit me!" was thick-browed, large-eyed Tian. The boy in turn saw that Xie recognized him and sighed a breath of relief. Xie, on the other hand, wasn't relieved, but rather he became more alarmed and raised his good arm in a defensive stance. In circumstances like this, it was more likely that this was an illusion created by something evil. "Weren't you with the others back in the desert? How are you here? Are you really Tiansheng?" Tiansheng explained hurriedly. "It's me. I'm the real thing. I'm not the only one. 3 other uncles also came. They're just inside. Look if you don't believe me." He pointed toward the inside of the palace, and sure enough, 3 men came running out. They were indeed the men from the caravan. When they saw Xie, they froze in their dash and looked awkward. Xie puffed a breath out before finally rising to his feet and dusting off his white sleeves. "What's going on?" The merchants looked at each other and no one made any noise. It was Tiansheng who spoke up after an awkward silence. "Gaga, after you guys left, Uncle Xiang's pain flared up, and he was really miserable. He didn't know how much longer we should wait for you to return, and we were afraid you guys might have gotten lost. As Yao said to go straight and to get to the kingdom of Ban Yue, so we thought more hands to help the better, so what he really meant to say was the merchants regretted letting them go after all. They were afraid that Xie and company would rob them of their guide after finding the Xiang fern for themselves, so they sent people to come follow them. Xie imagined that Fuyao couldn't persuade them otherwise and was probably also too lazy to hold them back. It was impossible to stop stubborn people who refused to listen to reason. Xie felt rather exasperated. "You're all too reckless. Who knows what there might be and what might happen in a place like this, and you still came?" Tiansheng himself knew that what they had done made it obvious they didn't trust Xie, and he felt bad. This was why he didn't make a sound while hiding in the weeds earlier, as awkward as it was. "Sorry, this concerns a man's life, so we can't sit still." No matter. This was a life-or-death situation, and to be wary was entirely natural. To go so far into danger for an antidote also proved that they were worthy companions. Xie couldn't continue to scold them for this and sighed. "If you didn't bump into anything weird when entering the territory, then it's your good fortune. But how did you know to come to this place to search for the Xiang fern?" Tiansheng scratched his head and replied, "We didn't know where to start, But in the story the Redcoats Gaga told, it was the queen who picked the leaves, right? The queen couldn't possibly leave the palace grounds, so I thought we'd come here and try our luck. Well, this child's mind could certainly spin, and it spun right on target, Celian thought. Just then, Sunlung spoke up from the side. Found it. Celian turned to see Sunlung striding with his long, lithe legs toward him. In his hands were a few turquoise-colored leaves with roots still attached to the stems. The leaves were about the size of a baby's palm and in the shape of peaches, lightly pointy at the ends with thin, tiny roots. Even without Ajiao to confirm, Celian knew without a doubt that this must be the Xiang fern. Without waiting for Celian to say a word, Sunlung grabbed his wounded hand and lifted it. The hand that was stung was originally frighteningly swollen. But after Sunlung sucked the poison from the wound, the swelling had gone down significantly, despite it not being fully cleared of the venom. With Celian's wrist in one hand and the Xiang fern in the other, Sunlung closed his palm on the plant. After only a second, he reopened his palm and the fern was crushed to a powder, without him appearing to exert any force. Sunlung gently but firmly rubbed the powder into Celian's hand, and he could feel the coolness and relief stinging it onto his skin. Thanks, Sunlung. Sunlung didn't respond, however, and after applying the powder, he let go of Celian's hand. Celian couldn't help but think that the air between the two of them now really was strange. He didn't know how to ask about it without sounding odd. This wasn't something anyone else would notice either, or something they could possibly understand. Gaga, are you feeling better? Is the herb working? Tian asked anxiously. Celian snapped out of it and replied, Much better. It should be the right herb. Hearing this, everyone became excited. Hurry, let's find more! Soon, Aziao also raised a handful of leaves, crying out, There's more here! The Xiang leaves in Aziao's hands were much bigger and fuller than the small, pitiful one Sunlung used earlier, but the shape and markings were all correct, so everyone crowded over and happily exclaimed, There's an entire field here! So many! Pick lots! Let's pick a bunch! Do you think we can sell this? Noisily, the merchants busied themselves picking the herbs. Celian turned his head to examine the hand for a moment. Then he tried to start a conversation with Sunlung. You also searched the same area now, right? Didn't you find any there? It was obvious Celian was trying to force a conversation, and after asking his question, he was rather pathetic, but Sunlung shook his head. You shouldn't use the ferns over there. Why? Celian wondered curiously. Before Sunlung could answer, they heard someone scream, Go away! Everyone stopped, their movements halting. Who said that? Who's screaming? It wasn't me. It wasn't me either. Then they heard that sharp voice again. Go away! You're stepping on me! Only then did the group notice. The voice came from near their feet. In a flash, the crowd retreated from that field of ferns. Seeing this, Celian walked over. He was used to being the one in the lead when it came to these things. He approached the bush where the shrieking had come from and stripped away the thick weeds. Everyone's breathing hitched. Under the weeds, in the mud, there was a man's face. In the field, there was an unbelievably alive human being buried in the mud with only his face showing above the surface. It was a nightmarish sight, truly incomparably creepy. A couple of merchants screamed in fright, holding on to each other. Celian once again comforted them in a skilled and practiced manner. Don't panic. Everyone calm down. It's only a face. Nothing extraordinary. We all have faces, no? That face chuckled. Oh, did I scare you? I frequently scare myself, too. After reassuring the others, Celian half-crouched to examine his face in the mud. It was a man's face, quite flat when he wasn't smiling, but extremely wrinkled when he was. Celian couldn't tell whether he was old or young, and couldn't say whether he was handsome or not. He couldn't make much out of this face at all, so he simply asked directly, Who are you? The face in the mud asked back, Who are you? We're merchants passing through, Celian replied. The mud-face breathed a long sigh.
Merchant passerby. I used to be part of a caravan too, but that was 50, maybe 60 years ago.
The situation just got freakier. Was a man buried in the grounds of an old city ruin for 50, 60 years still human? One of the merchants shakily asked in trepidation. Then how did a senior like yourself get here? The mud-face cleared his throat and screwed up his face.
I was captured by Banyue soldiers. I accidentally entered the city. They caught me and buried me here, and made me the fertilizer for their Xiang ferns.
No wonder the herb in their hands were big and full. They were fed with live humans. The merchants immediately dropped all the plants in their hands, feeling as though they were touching corpses. Xiaolian couldn't help but glance at his hand too, but heard Sunlong say, "That one was fine." No wonder that, even though Sunlong had looked through that field earlier, he left it to pick up a small, almost withered fern from elsewhere. He probably saw that was in the soil and guessed that the herbs were grown with human fertilizer, so he ignored the lot completely, then turned around and walked away until he found normally grown herbs in a remote area that was clean of corruption. Only after finding those herbs did he apply them to Xiaolian's hand. Sunlung was considerate and careful. "Thank you, truly," Xiaolian said. Sunlung nodded his head, but his face was still gloomy. Ever since Xiaolian was stung by that scorpion snake, Sunlung had behaved like this. A couple of days ago it was all "Gogo this, Gogo that," but now he hardly called him Gogo anymore. Other than sucking poison and applying herbs, Sunlung seemed to be avoiding bodily contact with him as much as possible, and though this thoroughly puzzled Xiaolian couldn't grasp what he was thinking, and it was making him feel unsettled. Just then the mud-face began to speak again.
I haven't seen real people in so many years. Can you come closer and let me see you all properly?
The merchants all looked at each other, everyone thinking they'd best not do what he asked. After a while, seeing no one stepped forward, the mud-face muttered,
What? You don't want to? Oh, what a shame.
"Why is it a shame?" Xiaolian turned and asked.
There's something that's been bothering me ever since you all arrived, the mud-face said. So I want to confirm with my own 2 eyes, which is why I asked you to stand closer for me to see. I want to see each and every one of you clearly to make sure.
To make sure of what? Xiaolian pressed. The mud-face cackled.
Don't be scared. I'll tell you. There's someone among you I've met before. 50 years ago.
Hair raised on everyone's necks at that statement. If someone met this mud-face 50 years ago, they'd be at least 60 or 70 by now. But among the people present, the oldest definitely didn't look older than 40. So how is that possible? Unless that person wasn't really a person. Xiaolian gave a sweeping look across everyone's faces, from Aziao to Tianxing. There were some in shock, some stricken with fear, some shaking with anxiety, some speechless and confused. Everyone's reaction was normal within reason. If you had to pick the odd one out, it'd be Sunlong. But for him, no reaction was probably the normal reaction. Xiaolian turned back to the mud-face. "Who is the person you speak of?" The facial muscles of that mud-face twitched, and it gave him an exceedingly freaky smile, as if it was giving his all to make itself look more reliable, but he couldn't fully conceal the sinister smirk hiding beneath. He beckoned mysteriously.
You, come closer and I'll tell you.
Xiaolian believed him 80% the first time the mud-face asked, but after this, only 50%. Who knew if this monster was only luring them closer to commit some evil deed? Of course, Xiaolian wouldn't listen. He got to his feet and was about to walk away when the mud-face raised his voice.
Do you really not want to know who it is? He will kill all of you, the same way he killed us.